Good afternoon to everybody, and let me also say that we are very happy to be part of this network, and we had so far a very interesting start. As Clement said, we were actually able to produce some cross-country papers, and as you can see, this panel was also supposed to have been cross-country, but somehow we lost our left wing here, maybe due to some longer than expected coalition talks in Germany or something else which we don't know yet.
Is the right wing seen from there?
Yeah, I know. That's what I was going to say. That there might be differences of views depending on which side of the room you are sitting. Now, the topic today is the future of EMU, and that is, of course, you can't make it more general than that. But I think people in the room know what we are talking about. They know the circumstances, the issues at stake. And therefore, we'd like to make this as much interactive as possible. And the idea was that everybody gets between 5 and 7 minutes to make an introductory statement. But let me perhaps abuse my position here to change that a little bit. And I would like to ask all three colleagues here one question which they hopefully answer in 1 minute or less. And the question is the following. If everything that you advocate were to be implemented, would the European economy be materially different in 2 years? And would it be materially different in 10 years? Right? And maybe I start with Massimo to my right. Just 1 minute.
1 minute. Well, okay. First of all, let me thank everybody thanks for inviting me and everybody for being here. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think yes, but what I'm going to propose, as I'm going to say, is that perhaps we should, for the moment, stop a moment with the euro area, think to other things, because I think that's what would be important to do at the moment, and that, I think that is going to would probably change a lot how the economy or the European economy is going to work in a few years.
So would be much better? Would be materially better off?
Well, at least we will try to solve some of the problems that we still have. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that perhaps the point which we will insist more is to go on some kind of fundamental European public goods, which we are not providing at a good level. And so I think this would be improved. I'm thinking of things like defense, security.
You'll have your time.
Okay.
Okay, no, as part of the 1 minute, because the answer is yes. I mean, you cannot ask a policymaker to say,
that's true.
You say, look, in 2 years, in 6 months already, it will be better. So, no, yes, definitely. I think what is on the table, what we are going to put on the table, I think is going to, if implemented properly, is going to strengthen I think resilience of the economy, so in terms of capacity to withstand the next crisis whenever that will come, I think we'll be in a better position to have that, and we would avoid, let's say, the existential trauma that we had back, 2012, 2013. And also, since we put a lot of emphasis also on the medium to long term, I mean, we tend to we like to think that we have, as an institution, a lower discount rates than the governments. We will be in a better position in terms of longer term prospects.
Okay, so both the average growth performance should improve and the resilience to shocks.
I would think so.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it's not what. Yes. Okay. So to answer the question, the answer is also yes for me. I think if we put in place our proposition, it will improve the situation in the European Union and in the Eurozone in the 2 years and in 10 years. And the two main issues are better deal with crisis, and that's the point of Marco, and it's exactly the same. And the second one is reconvergence in the euro area. The fact that we should have closer standard of living in the coming years, and not the situation we had since the creation of the euro.
Okay, as a panel is now complete, and just to inform Thomas that I changed a bit the usual setup. Everybody will have 5 to 7 minutes soon. But I had first asked everybody to answer a simple question, which is the following. Assume everything you propose will be implemented fully. Would that have a material impact on the European economy in the short run, let's say in 2 years, and in the long run, let's say 10 years?
What do you want to have implemented?
No,
what you proposing?
What I propose. I haven't proposed anything yet.
Or what you think would be the ideal?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Sorry for being late. This changing in the timing had not reached me, but that may be a problem on my side. So I actually wanted to propose a number of things, and maybe I have the time later on to do that. Okay. And I think that first of all, we need to find a way to propose credible things, and that is exactly in the direction of your question. I think we need to, whatever we propose now, we need to think about how to implement it and how to improve what we have today in the sense of successful implementation. I mean, I think that's the borderline. I think we should really stop in Europe to propose big things and to not deliver. I think we have seen far too much of that, and I mean, you know, everybody has some examples for that. We have announced to become the most competitive region in the world. We have never reached that target. We thought that youth unemployment was too high, so we decided the youth guarantee, promising to every unemployed young man or woman to have an offer in the next 6 months. We have never done much of a thing to achieve that. So I think actually implementation is the name of the game today.
Okay. Now, so you can imagine why I asked the question. When you have your 5 to 7 minutes, if you could please then also think how materially the things that you are proposing or that you think would be ideal would actually translate into more resilience and higher average growth. Massimo, we start with you again.
Okay, thank you very much again for the invitation. Let me say that I'm very much sympathetic with the presentation of the new group, Econ, what is the name? EconPol Europe. I think it is very important to try to make this kind of a bridge across countries, because one of the big problems that we have in Europe is actually that the media market, but also in a sense research market, are completely separated. So I have exactly the same feeling that Clemens has, that when you travel to Berlin, people speak, and you seem to have gone in another outer world. If you go to France or if you go to Italy, you have different view. So I really think that all these kind of initiatives should be supported. I'm very glad to participate. Okay, the human area. I mean, the way which I interpreted the title, because clearly it was a very vague title was something to say, how will you do, what will you do to fix the euro area? What should you do? I mean, my feeling is, I might be wrong, but this is a moment in which we are here to discuss. Probably to fix the euro area will probably not begin with the euro area. I mean, I think that of course this is risky because another financial crisis can come tomorrow, and then we are still not ready to resist to such a crisis. But it's also true that at the moment the legacy of high debt, the scars of the recession are still so high that I'm afraid that we are not able to spend a lot of capital, political capital, to try to make steps, and maybe these steps are not convincing, or we might end up in a situation that we have seen many times in Europe, which we find an agreement on something, but then everybody interprets the agreement in a different way. This is a typical characteristic. Where we should, I think instead we should go, I think we should have a very ambitious agenda on some of the things we have been discussing for a long time, like things like defense, border control, security, immigration, environment, digital economy, infrastructure, and so on. These are more or less the content of the recent Macron speech in Sorbonne. I think that we should go in that direction because I think there is much more consensus among European citizens on the need to centralize this function. There are strong national and international reasons which push in this direction. And probably to that I would also add, since this is another thing we have been discussing for 20 years, and maybe now Brexit gives us an opportunity about harmonizing capital corporate taxation. I mean, we do have a number of problems. You were asking before, Daniel, why you think that your proposal are going to do better for the economy. I mean, we do have a problem in Europe, which is a problem of tax competition, tax evasion, and you know, there are some countries in Europe which it's hard not to consider them like something like tax even. So I think we have to make some step forward in this direction. I think that this is a collective thing that we have to do. Of course, making progress in this field is not at all easy. Despite Brexit, there will be going to be strong resistance across between groups and organized groups. Also, now we also have a problem with the populistic nationalistic movement, which are on the rise in any European country. But this is the best way which we can answer to this question, showing that Europe can deliver. Of course, this will not fix the euro area, but hopefully we try to create a better climate which might allow us to make some step forward in the future. And also, if we don't manage to make some step forward on these things, where there is a clear economic rationale to go on, because these are things which we definitely can do better together that alone, I don't really see how we can make much step forward in the EMU area. What about the EMU area? Which is the problem of the EMU area? I think that EMU area, I think that, I mean, at least economists would agree which are the problem. I mean, it's still an incomplete monetary union, so it's a potentially fragile construction, and since it's a potentially fragile construction, it might perform suboptimally. Which are the three problems, as I see, but I think that a lot of economists would agree with that. There is no central budget, not sufficient of central budget. We do have the European budget, but it's only 1% of GDP, and it's not there to play stabilization role. So we don't have a macroeconomic stabilization mechanism which can take care of asymmetric shock. We have some loose form of cooperation across country, which are supported by the Commission, but they work very little. There is no country which, when deciding its fiscal policy, take into account the effect of its fiscal policy on other country. And as we know, if there is spillover effect, this leads to suboptimal national equilibrium. And even the rule is such that if we want, we can force some country to spend less, maybe, but we cannot force another country to spend more if it doesn't want to do, even if a lot of people would agree that it should. And maybe we would not want to do it anyhow, because national preference has to be respected. So what we will need a federal budget which can make a federal, we could decide how to spend this money, but we have neither a federal budget, nor we have a federal government. So that's the one problem. In terms of the fact, since we do not have a federal fiscal policy, 2 minutes. Okay, so let me click. We also run the risk of overburdening monetary policy, particularly in situation zero interest rate. And of course, we have seen it happening now. The monetary policy has been the only federal institution which try to support demand, but pushing only or relying only on monetary policy might have a number of unpleasant consequences. And like, for example, the possibility of creating bubble for the future in zero interest rate. And there are very limited insurance mechanisms that allow to smooth asymmetric shock across country. We do have some worker mobility, but it's much more limited for the reason that we know. There is little integration capital market, and the banking union is still incomplete. And of course, if we have to find some way to, to increase insurance, risk insurance, we also have to find more risk reduction. So I think this is the way. We have made some step forward in the past, introducing enhanced fiscal surveillance of the country, common supervision of the main bank, the ESM, but they are still incomplete. So that's the point, and where there are a number of proposals on the ground, but maybe the reason why I'm a bit critical of this proposal, I will say something more in the next, when you allow me to speak again. Thank you.
I allow you immediately to answer me one further question. You talked about tax harmonization as one issue, corporate tax harmonization, plus, let's say, demand management in the broadest sense, monetary and fiscal policy. Would you expect from these instruments or measures that you have in mind a level effect on GDP or permanently higher growth?
Well, that's a very difficult thing. I mean, sorry, it's a difficult thing. I think that clearly if you can improve something in terms of tax coordination, tax organization, you certainly introduce less distortion in the allocation of capital. This should increase increase the longer run growth of the economy. So I'm expecting this will have even some positive effect in terms of the longer run growth. In terms of macroeconomic, in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of macroeconomic management, that is more a stabilization issue. I mean, from that point of view, I'm more on the supply side. I mean, I think that what we will need to do is to have to make the economy works better. I mean, but if you have a crisis, then you have to find way even to address this crisis, because otherwise the risk is that you might have effect on the supply side as well, because you have effect which remain.
Okay, thanks. I think some of these themes will be taken up by Marco, and you can already imagine what I'm going to ask you, in case you don't address it yourself.
Okay, no, thank you very much. First of all, let me thank Clemens for his introduction. I mean, the point of not having sufficient dialogues, across frontiers, I think is not only an academic issue. It's actually very important also because it has material consequences. And I think what we found during the crisis was that the different narratives in different countries on the origin of the crisis, its persistence, etc., had led to a heated debate and very controversial debate, which actually hampered the finding of a common solution and led to a lot of hesitation, procrastination, etc. So, especially in times of duress, I think different interpretations actually can have material consequences. So it's important that this not only for broader academic understanding, but also for formulation of policies which are effective. Now on the issue. Okay, first of all, I show you the book. We have just published today our autumn forecast, just presented by the commissioner a couple of hours ago. And what we find here is that we are entering into good times. We are not saying in the forecast that we are fully in good times already, but certainly in a better position than we were only, let's say, a year or even 6 months ago. Growth is robust, is also very broad-based. So for the first time, not only we have positive growth in all parts of the EU, but there is a reconvergence after a period of divergence during the crisis. So I think this is overall good news. There is a downside of this, and it is usually that the worst mistakes are usually done in good times. So this is something that we have to be very watchful about. And and typically the experience that we have had in the past 10 years since the beginning of the crisis, but probably also before, is that we have operated under what I have called in many occasions, we have operated under the ultima ratio paradigm. So only when we were shoulder against the wall, we found the courage to bounce back and make courageous decisions. And this applies both at the national level and it applies at the Euro area level. So I think what we need to do now really is to fight back against the temptation of complacency, sit down and wait for because the economy is doing better. What we have in our forecast is yes, in the outlook in the short term is positive, but we have a problem of potential growth, which is a massive one. So one of the tasks that we are going to have to face now is to push through the structural reforms which actually boost the growth potential looking forward. We can do something at the Euro area and the European level on this. I think we have some of the issues mentioned by Massimo before are clearly top of the agenda, but a lot of the work, let's face it, has to be done at the national level.
So really you should have two forecasts, one current policies and one if everything is implemented, what you're proposing, everything plus 1%.
Look, what we do in our forecast has a specific role in the economic surveillance that we have. So we are very rigorous actually on the no policy change. That's why, in a sense, go back to what Thomas indicated at the very beginning. When we go to, we have added now 2019, which is an unchanged policies, it shows also when there is a gap on the fiscal side, how much one is expect the government to do in order to bridge the gap. So this is the situation. Now, looking forward in terms of priorities, I think, is it the time to lower the ambition? I don't think so. I think we have to be very ambitious indeed. I think we have a window of opportunities economically. I think against the odds in the debate politically, we also have a window of opportunity now to make a step forward. Obviously, we are not, naive, so we know that there will be obstacles, and one has to do things in a measured way. But I think in trying to outline what to do, one has to take a bit, let's say, 3 criteria. Okay, the first one, we have to put forward proposals which are economically rational. So this is, I think, is important. I think what we'll need to do is to try to sketch out what is the final equilibrium. I'm talking here in particular for the euro area, but can also for the EU as a whole. So to anchor the choices that we make in the short term. And on this, for the final stage of EMU, what we have called the banking union, I think the fiscal union and the economic union, I think one can discuss what the content is of this, I think are all important. The second thing is the choices have to be financially robust. This means that we have to proceed on the risk sharing and risk reduction, being very careful that certain elements of risk reduction, if not with the proper sequencing, they risk to turn out to lead to financial instability. For example, for example, I think, and I go straight to the point because I know what you have in mind. I tell you what I think. When you have proposals that, in case of liquidity assistance, imply or request an automatic restructuring of the debt, this is risk increasing. It's not risk reducing. So this is, I'll give you an example which is, it has been part of the debate. So with the proper approach and the proper sequencing, I think we can make these proposals financially, let's say, robust. And then politically viable, obviously. And here on the political viability, there is an issue of proceeding step by steps. Now, what we are looking at is to have, after the discussion in the Eurogroup, the proposals of the Commission on the 6th of December and the Euro Area Summit to have a mandate to make progress for in view of June 2018. So it is obvious that we cannot achieve everything by June 2018, far from there, but we have to make substantive progress. Now, on what is the priority, I think for the short term, let's say the next 6 to 9 months, looking at mid next year, I think the most urgent issue is on the banking union side. So I think there has been a discussion there on at the Eurogroup level, proposals by the Commission mid-October. I think we can complete, and we have the chance to complete the second pillar of banking union with the fiscal backstop for the Single Resolution Fund. I think there is rather broad agreement. Jeroen Dijsselbloem, president of the Eurogroup, has said it, to have the ESM as the backstop. And I think we have a chance to make decisive progress on the on EDIS, so the deposit guarantee, let's say, in line with the proposal of the Commission of mid-October, going through a staged, let's say, progress on that front. So this is, let's say, first priority. We can come back to the next.
Because now on my left, I have, let's say, people from two countries which are commonly taken to be the decisive decision makers on what is politically viable. If you permit me 1 minute, please. You were commenting on the forecast that it's a big degree of convergence. I mean, all countries are growing at similar rates. And I take this occasion to make publicity for a paper which we are presenting tomorrow, where we look at two different issues. One is the degree of correlation among countries in their business cycles, which can be very high, and then the amplitude, which can be very different. So if the amplitude is very different, then in the middle of the cycle, you have perfect correlation. You have the same growth rates for everybody. But that's misleading because some countries will accelerate a lot and others less. And then when you at peak and the trough of the cycle, then you have divergences again. So maybe, right, this might be an intermediate phase, which is somewhat misleading. I close the parenthesis and I turn to my neighbor here. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you first for inviting me to this conference. I think it's very useful to have those discussions about the Eurozone, the European Monetary Union, and more specifically, because as it was already said, the diagnosis of the crisis is quite different from one country to another, from one academics to another, and it's very useful to exchange on that. I won't talk about the European Union agenda, so I will focus really on the Eurozone, so I won't say anything on tax harmonization, defense, or many different things that are on the table now, or in Macron's speech at La Sorbonne a few weeks ago. So I will focus on the Eurozone. And when we look at the Eurozone, the first thing to say is that many reforms have been implemented in response to the economic and finance crisis. So we have done many things, regarding the establishment of the banking union. It was a really big move of the Eurozone, and it's a big thing. And the creation of a crisis management mechanism, the MES, it's a big, the ESM, it's an important step too. But however, in my view, the euro area continues to show major shortcomings, hindering its ability to cope with a new crisis. And this, I think this is key, and this is what we have to discuss about the Eurozone. Those shortcomings, the first one is the divergence of living standards between the Eurozone countries. Not the European Union country, it's different, but really the Eurozone country. We have a large divergence of standard of living since 2000 and especially after the crisis, but even before the crisis. My second point is that in a situation of a new crisis, I think that we can have a symmetric shock in the Eurozone, which could lead to very different situations in the different countries. So to say it, we can have symmetric or asymmetric shock, I think it's not really important. What is important is that with symmetric or asymmetric shock, we will have asymmetric consequences for the different countries. And I think this is key. And in my view, there are three main reasons why.
Okay, yes.
Can
you give us examples?
Yeah. The first one is macroeconomic imbalances, and the fact that at the beginning of the crisis, the competitiveness levels of the country are different. So that's the first element. The second one is the fact that the capital flows are too volatile in the Eurozone. So as we have seen in the previous crisis, we can have large change of capital flows in a very short period of time. And this could be detrimental to some countries. My third point is about the difficulties for some country to finance stabilization expenditure in a time of crisis. To say bluntly, it's about the level of sovereign interest rate in a time of crisis. So we have those three channels in time of crisis, and we have to organize ourselves in the Eurozone in order to be sure that the next crisis will have less impact And we already have done some part of the work, but we need to do more. And in order to do more, we have two pillars. The first one is, and it's the same one as Marcos said, it's about responsibility of countries and solidarity between the different countries in the Eurozone. So about responsibility, it's make in each country the necessary structural reforms. That's the first point. And the second one is, of course, about sound public finances in all countries. But at the same time, we don't think that it's enough to have this responsibility or risk reduction, pillar. We also need a stronger solidarity pillar in the Eurozone with three main things. And the first one is financial integration. It's about having a real banking union, banks all over Europe and liquidity and capital going from one country to another in order to have private risk sharing in the Eurozone. That's the first point. The second one is about more economic integration to better coordinate our policies. This is about imbalances, competitiveness issue and things like that. And we think that it's important too. And the last one, it's about fiscal integration. We need, in order to reduce those divergences in the Eurozone, have an investment capacity. And that was what President Macron said in his speech in La Sorbonne. We think it's useful to have this investment capacity in order to reduce, the difference of productivity or even competitiveness between the different Eurozone countries. And at the same time, with this fiscal capacity, we need a stabilization function in order to absorb shocks in a time of crisis. This is not. This is complementary, in my view, with the DSM and the crisis management mechanism. So that's a big program, and we know that's a very big. Those are big issue, and probably we need time, we need a roadmap, we need and in order to do that, but we think this is important to go in that direction for the Eurozone in order to be more resilient.
So to be concrete, let's assume Federal Reserve has misjudged the US business cycle. It increased interest rates too much. We have a sudden recession in the US. Now, what are the things you mentioned, the new things? How would they come into play? You have a common shock.
Yeah.
You think it will affect countries differentially?
Yes, exactly.
And how would the things that you have mentioned then come into play?
If you have more private risk sharing regarding banking union and capital market union, it will help country during the crisis. So this is the first point. So,
and outside the crisis also?
This is less important outside the crisis, but it's important too to better finance. You have two reasons to have a banking union. It's to better finance companies in the Eurozone. That's the first one. And that's the most important in a way. And the second one is to better deal with crises with private risk sharing between the different countries and the different people of the Eurozone.
No, actually, what I thought that you would say that, let's assume it's not a crisis, it's just a business cycle downturn. Would then the fiscal solidarity, the fiscal shock absorbers, the investment function, would you then put that into motion?
Yeah, we think regarding the fiscal capacity, but it's different from financial integration. But regarding fiscal capacity, yes, we think that it's useful in order to have stronger, better convergence between the country to have an investment capacity. So it's a permanent investment capacity.
Okay, so let's say the U.S. business cycle goes down.
Yeah.
Germany is most exposed to trade with the United States, so Germany suffers most, and therefore the EU will finance more investment in Germany.
Yeah, but, the idea is that because what really happened in the previous crisis is not really about increasing investment, but what we saw, and this is key, is a sharp decrease.
Yeah, prevents a decline.
Yeah, prevent decline. Yes, true, exactly. If we have a strong shock in Germany, yeah, we should prevent decline of investment in Germany. It's quite clear.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thomas, you have the last word.
I don't think it's the last word for today. I would have liked to be able to say thank you to Clemens Fuß for his introductory speech, but I missed it, so I'm sorry. So I can't say that, but I'm sure it was a good speech and a good start into this conference. Marco, I looked at your new book, which is always a good read, of course. You said that we were entering good times. I was a bit surprised to hear that, because what I see here is pretty good growth since 2014 at least. So that's 4 years down the road. The growth you have just projected has been revised upwards to 2.2% for the Eurozone. I think that's absolutely in the trend and can't be, criticized. If I look a couple of pages further down the road, it's the potential growth. And the potential growth for this year is estimated at 1.4. So I don't give much to the precision of this estimation. But what I want to say is that I think we are definitely in good times. We're not starting to go into good times, we are in good times. If we have 4 years of good growth, one needs to think about, when is the next turning point showing up? I don't think it would be correct to say, let's just enjoy it, we're starting to have good times. I mean, this may last for a while, but I'm not sure for how long it may last. So I think, to reinforce your point, there's no way for complacency, there's not the moment for complacency. We have to use the good times. I mean, I'm not a real Keynesian, but if I was, I would say this is the time to have surpluses in the budget, to reduce budget deficits, to build up buffers for fiscal policies. But definitely we need to do something to increase our growth potential. I mean, and this is maybe where we share our risk analysis or our analysis as a whole, to be not complacent. Let me go one step back. I think we are in quite interesting processes. We have this Tusk agenda, the leaders agenda as it's called, the EU27 process, an EU27 agenda which is also taking place at the Eurogroup, has been taking place at the Eurogroup on Monday. We had for the first time this enlarged format also there, preparing for this Eurozone summit in December. I think this is for a good reason so, and Juncker has explained it, and I think President Macron has also said something about it. All of these 27 but one are, if you look at the treaty, future Eurozone members. So let's include them if we talk about the future. I think that's correct. Another reason to look at 27, I think, is that if we analyze what needs to be done at the Eurozone, I think we will detect that lots of the questions we are dealing with are actually single market issues. Like the banking union, I would fully agree that we have to work to complete it. We can't maybe agree today here on the podium which steps to take exactly and immediately, and in which order, but I think the fact that we need a banking union and a capital market union is absolutely decisive. But this is mainly an EU27 issue, I would say. So the good times are the moment to prepare for bad times, and I said raising potential of growth, preparing for the digital age is also a classical EU27 and single market issue, and will decide on our economic strength in the future, Eurozone or not Eurozone, of course. Banking problems, I don't need to add any more there. I think we have, if we look at the figures also in this new book, we have a serious public debt problem in Europe. Full stop. Next paragraph. If you look back into the crisis, you could say other regions, other countries in the world have much higher debt to GDP ratios than the Eurozone. True. But there was only one region in the world where investors withdrew for certain countries their trust, their confidence into financing these economies from one day to the other, and that was in Europe. And I think we have to take that seriously. And I think we have to, one element we really have to deliver to reestablish once and for all this confidence into the Eurozone public finances is that we bring the high debt levels on a downward path. And I think we cannot just wait for growth and for inflation to come to produce that in the end, because if we wait for that, we might wait until the next downswing. And then, there's no margin of maneuver for fiscal policy. And I think this is even more important to cater for right now than to have something on the wall for the year 2025 and a fiscal fiscal capacity by then. I don't think we shouldn't talk about it, but I think there are really issues for today, for today's policies. I think if we look at Europe, it's very important to analyze properly the situation before we come up with answers, in the sense that let's not find an answer before we have defined the question or the problem. And I think there are definitely some problems which are truly European, like how to protect our borders, you know, environment, trade, security. There's lots of new stuff which has come up in the last years. That's truly European, so we need to do it European. We need to find European solutions to that, because these are problems that the nation states are not able to deal with. So full stop. There are other problems which point to the existence of structural problems in certain member states. So if a member state has always had a very high ratio of youth unemployment, there is a structural problem in that country. So the problem can only be solved in that country. And I won't say that Europe has nothing to do with that. We can give advice, we can give money, we can support it, we can coordinate policies in other countries and in Europe, but we have to accept that the problem is in the country. So it has to be made clear that the problem needs to be solved there. And we can accommodate that. There's a lot to do for European policies. But if we mix these levels, we will fail. Because if we just throw money at a country which has a structural problem, this will not help. It will help in the short term, but not in the long term. So I think that is very important. To come to an end, two issues briefly. Convergence has been mentioned. I think convergence is an interesting issue. Looking at the figures sometimes helps, as the lawyers say. If you look into the legal text, it helps you in analyzing the legal solution. That's also true for economists. So some look at the figures. If you look at convergence in the Eurozone, and you can do it at the same way for the EU27, and you group the countries a little bit together, because there are plenty of them, of course. What you can see is that there's an ongoing convergence process since the first day until now for the East. That is true for the Eastern countries in the monetary union and outside the monetary union. If you look at that curve, if you just group these together into one line on a chart, I don't have it, so I have it here, but not there. There's only one little hiccup in that curve, which is a steadily rising curve, and that is one single year in the crisis. That's all. If not, there's a whole, and by convergence I mean converging to the average of the Eurozone, of course. And you might choose the indicator as you like. There are several possibilities, but it's a clear picture. So convergence is ongoing. Sorry. If you look at the north and the middle and the south, the picture is different. There was a very nice convergence process in the first 10 years of the Eurozone. Germany coming down from 110% of the average towards 100. Italy coming from 105, getting closer to the average. France, I think, in between. And then, since the crisis, the situation changed. The southern bloc is going below the 100% line. So there's real deconvergence in a sense, if that exists. And for the north and the middle, and we put France and Germany, of course, always together, so also in that graph we put this together, they are taking off and you know, you can say dragging upwards the average, but you can also say deconverging in the other direction. So also here, I think we have to analyze the situation properly. Convergence is going on in the East. That's a very strong and positive signal. We never talk about it for one reason or the other. I think we should. There's a real problem of convergence in the sense that people are losing track of the average, and that's in the South. And there's some strength in the northern and middle European bloc. I think that also might need some further reflection. And then resilience. I mean, we've looked at the setup which we have today, because people tend to speak about an incomplete setup for the Eurozone. You have a number of things which should strengthen resilience in the Eurozone and in the European Union as a whole. I think the single market again is there. If you talk about the shock, what happens if an economy is hit by a shock, the more it's integrated into an internal market, of course, the more the effects on this one economy get, you know, rolled on to the outer rim of that country. Of course, you have other markets to which you sell, you have other producers from which you buy. So this is flattening the shock. You have banking union and capital market union just in the way as Emmanuel described, which should help here significantly if we get this thing right as a shock absorber in that area. And then we have the coordination of reform policies in the EU semester, the European semester. We can always discuss whether this is fully efficient, but the mechanism is clearly there. And we have, of course, coordination of fiscal policy. And if you look at this framework, which is quite discredited today, because I think we lost a little bit the consensus on what this is good for and whether one should apply it at all. So I think we need to go into this again and rebuild the confidence into a new fiscal policy framework for the monetary union. But what you find in there is the target of a zero budget deficit in normal times. And this is exactly what you need to be flexible in bad times, because it means that in good times you have a surplus. If you then enter a downswing or a shock, you can just let your fiscal budget slow, and you don't have to worry about a deficit right then. But of course, the request is, and the limitation is, you have to reach that position of MTO, of the medium-term objective of the zero deficit budget, and we never do. So I warn a little bit about saying, okay, this is quite good in theory, but we have a problem in reaching it. Let's look for something else. I don't think for credibility reasons only, this is not the best way to do. We should first, maybe rediscuss the rules and maybe simplify them, or definitely simplify them, agree on how to focus them and how to implement them. But only if we create a good track record on what we have already, then we can move, or we should move ahead into new territory. So in one last sentence, because Daniel is getting nervous, I think there are some things where we need to apply better, and there are some areas where we need to develop our framework and then apply it better. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Marco, you got stimulated.
Okay, no, thank you very much. No, I agree with most of the things that Thomas said. Actually, on the policy prescriptions, on the need to seize the opportunity to improve resilience, structural reforms, the focus on public debt, tackle the financial regime. He didn't mention it, but tackled what is remaining in fragilities in the banking system. I think this is of utmost importance. So I agree with a lot of things. Let me come to the very first point he made on good times or better times. It is true that we have had growth coming back since now a few years, 18 quarters of positive growth for the euro area as a whole, but we know where we come from. If you go back 2013, 2014, even with very conservative estimates of output gap that we have in our with our production function method, we still had the output gap of 3%. We are closing the output gap only in 2018 in our forecast here. So that's why I'm saying that we are in better times but not in full good times. And if you take other measures of economic slack, we are still not there. Look at the labor market, who is behaving quite strongly actually. But if you take measures of unemployment which are beyond the classic definition of unemployment, the discouraged workers, involuntary part-time, we are still far away from the pre-crisis period. We have
the opposite.
You say the opposite, but it's not true.
Let me just give you one indicator which goes in the opposite direction. Yeah. The labor force participation rate has increased without any hiccup, and has increased through the crisis. So all the indications are actually that our labor markets are stronger. Not all this overall indicator indicates that labor markets are actually stronger than before.
Labor participation, I agree, and actually it is. Let's not get excessively depressed in the comparison with the US. We have seen the opposite trend there, which is I think is an excellent thing. If you take the U6 unemployment definition that I'm taking, we are still about 4 percentage points higher now than we were before the crisis. So I think this there is still some slack there. You take inflation, core inflation, which is still below. So the policy prescription that emerges from this forecast here is that it's still not time to rein back the macroeconomic, let's say, accommodative policies. Let me say one final thing, and I think is which is important. I think, and it's a bit against what you said, Thomas, but I think you would agree. Not because I qualify certain elements. No, it is true. It is true that we have had in the first 10 years of the crisis nice convergence. But let's face it, it was dopé. It was not a convergence which was a real one. I mean, part irrational exuberance, part is because of the boost of EMU with the reducing interest rates. And so what you have had there is actually real convergence if you take GDP per capita, the classic, but there was structural divergence underneath. And that's what has happened. Actually, it came to the fore when the crisis hit. You look at the indicators, I mentioned it several times, I mean, of, let's say, core Europe, and here I always hesitate to put France, but since you put it with Germany, fine, in this particular case. If you look at the share of tradables versus non-tradables, core Europe and the periphery, you see actually that the structural divergence increased during the first 10 years. So it was the period in which things went more or less fine, and that's why we have to be aware of complacency now, because if we do a bit the same thing, we find ourselves with facing the next crisis in a position which is, I think, is even worse than we are now.
I know narratives matter, but still our topic here is the future, right? So I know there are some difference of opinion over the past. I want also to get the audience an occasion to ask questions. If you allow me, I wanted to just add one thing to what Thomas said and ask perhaps a couple of you. And that's the following issue. If the Eurozone does what you and many other people advocate, namely that every country insures itself by running appropriate budget surpluses and getting down debt levels, the consequence is likely to be an increase in current account surplus of the euro area. And now you could say, who cares? Policy in the euro area is done only looking at the euro area itself. Or you could say that is not appropriate in a world which is anyway awash with excess savings, and it keeps the interest rate permanently at the zero bound. So the simple question which I have is, should we, in setting policy and setting policy frameworks for the euro area, should we look only at our own interests, how we can stabilize ourselves, or should we look also at what contribution the euro area can make to the global equilibrium? Very brief. I know it's a very vast matter, but in the end the answer is simple. Should we do it? Should we look mainly at ourselves and say we behave like a small country, or do we have a global responsibility?
That's a big one.
Yeah, it needs a small answer.
Okay, I try a small answer. Scaling it down, I think we have to first look into our own monetary union. This is what people have been talking about here from different angles. If we get our act together, that should reduce imbalances within the Eurozone. And I think then we have a better chance of arguing our regional case in a worldwide context and in a worldwide economic debate. I think that is the step. I think we need to take more responsibility worldwide, but I think since we are struggling inside what to do and how to move forward and how to strengthen our own character, and whether this is to be done here or there, and whether we need strong institution or not, and this kind of things, we need to sort out this thing first, and then look at the wider context.
Okay. I was tempted to ask Massimo, because he is the one who doesn't have any institutional responsibilities, how you would react to that. Should we set our policy making in just looking at ourselves, being as a small country, or do we have, as a Eurozone, a global responsibility?
Well, let me also react on some of the things that the others said. Otherwise, yeah, I mean, on this, I pretty much agree with Thomas, actually, because it seems to me that we still have a number of problems that we have to solve. And one of the reasons why we have built up a European Union than a Euro area, because perhaps we want still to be important in the world. So as a second step, you want also to consider which are your effects on the rest of the world. But at the moment, I would certainly give a priority to our own problem. Can I just react to some of the things which have been said? How much time you give me?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, 2 minutes. Okay, in 2 minutes, I want to just to say that I mean it is very important to have this kind of meeting, because clearly you can you can find things in which you agree or you disagree. So, for example, if you had gone to Italy and what just Thomas said before, we have get a good time for the last 4 years. I mean, the reaction would be pretty bad in the sense that that was the average, but the result was very different across country, and Italy has paid a particularly high cost because of what happened, and even the things that we done. Now I think that we are entering good times, and from this point of view, you might be surprised, but I perfectly agree with Thomas on this point. This is the moment in which we have to do more, and there is a very high legacy of debt, and so we have to do more about that. And I think that we have to strengthen and enforce the rule. I don't know how much I can say here, because I'm a member of the European Fiscal Board. We have prepared a report. This report will be public in a couple of weeks, so I cannot anticipate what is in the report. But certainly we made a number of proposals where I think we could strengthen the rule. Let me just say the last point about convergence, since you had mentioned your own study. I also want to advertise some of mine, okay? And because convergence can be a complicated thing. So of course, if you talk about convergence, if you look only to the GDP rate or whatever, clearly there has been divergence in the crisis. Now the things are improving, and indeed, for example, if you look to Italy, if you take per capita GDP growth, it's actually been faster more recently than Germany or France or whatever. But the most important thing is which is the convergence of the public sector, the function of the public sector, because you would expect that if the country became more close on some structural things, that then they might work better. Now, you had a crisis, some countries had to adjust this crisis, you had capital flight, so of course you had the divergence and reduction of price. But if you look to the convergence on fundamental services, it seems to be that the convergence has increased even during the crisis, even with the adjustment. If you look at things like health, education, and labor market, there seems to be more convergence, even with the Southern Europe than with respect to other countries. There is only one point, and this is going to be very important, that's going back to what we were discussing, where you see a lot of divergence, and this is about trust in institutions. And that is maybe a very dangerous thing in terms of what you can actually do in terms of policy in the future. Stop.
Excellent, thank you. We still have 30 minutes left, so I turn to the audience to see whether there are any questions. Okay, usually when you have a large audience, you have few questions, but this is different. I go 1, 2, and 3 there. Okay, why don't you go first? There should be a wandering microphone, or if you just speak very loudly, then we can understand you.
Yes, a question to Mr. Westphal and to Mr. Bordignon. They both mentioned the legacy debt, the debt burden, which is obviously a problem. But yes, thank you. Mr. Westphal and Mr. Bordignon both mentioned the legacy debt and the debt burden. But if we look at the economic figures, we can actually see that debt in the EU is around 90% of GDP. Debt in the US is around 110% of GDP. While investment in the EU has dropped around 10% since the beginning of the crisis, and the investment in the US has increased around 10% or even more. So is it really that investors withdrew their confidence in the EU because of the debt burden? And should we really focus our efforts in the future on debt reduction? Or is it really other issues of structural nature in the euro area that we should be tackling? And my name is Alexander Alessandro from the European Economic and Social Committee.
Thank you.
Thanks.
There was two to you and to Massimo. Yeah. Okay. Briefly.
No, okay. I agree what you say. I don't think that there is any. I mean, different from many other people here. I don't think that there is something like an optimal level of debt, so that things works when debt is 30%, that things do not work when debt is 130%. What I think is that some countries, particularly my country, even other countries, the periphery have to reduce the ratio of debt. This is not because there is some kind of general level things, but for two basic reasons. The first is that any shift, when you have debt is so high, any shift in the interest rate, it can put you in trouble. I mean, there is enough to increase by one. We have seen you might have a negative dynamic, explosive dynamic as soon as the interest goes up, and so that's the first point. The second thing is, of course, we still have the problem that we are not the owner of our own currency, because how the currency is determined depends on the center. I mean, so we still have, and that's what we had to overcome, a redenomination risk, which might be explosive in some crises. So that's to avoid that, we definitely need to reduce our debt level. So on that there is no doubt whatsoever. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thomas?
Very briefly. Yeah, I think from my point of view, your linkage between the debt level and the investment level is a bit too direct. Because, I mean, a deficit is not, public expenditure can be at 20% of GDP, they can be at 60% of GDP. It seems to be you need to have an agreement in your society to finance it. I mean, that's the point. You can finance 60% of public expenditure. If you get 60% of GDP in tax receipts, then it's fine. You don't have a deficit. That's your decision. You can do it. If you have a certain level of public expenditure, you can spend it on consumption or you can spend it on investment. So that's the question which we call the quality of public finances. And actually the finance ministers in the Eurozone discussed this a lot. I mean, they just had a discussion on Monday on spending on education. So I think we also need to have a debate, how well is the money spent? And a deficit, as I said, is an agreement within the society to finance it or not. If there is a permanent deficit, it's just a hint for me that the society is not willing to pay what the state is going to spend. So I think the link between should we maintain a higher debt level or even push it higher to finance investment, I don't think it's the right question. And if not, I agree very much, of course, to the argument of the interest rate, which fragilizes, makes a country fragile in situation of stress from one day to the other. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. There was a cluster of questions, 1, 2, 3 over there. Okay, now it's too many, but you go first.
Thank you. My name is Leo Hoffmann-Axtheim. I work on Eurozone governance for Transparency International, and wanted to focus, since we're talking about the future of EMU, the debate also a bit on the one aspect that is often underplayed in this context, which is the democratic accountability and the legitimacy of EMU. So one problem that we have at the moment is, of course, that southern economies, the people there by and large have the feeling that Eurozone has not really helped them. In the north, they have the feeling that they are on the hook for southern countries. So there's a quite broad dissatisfaction really in the population about these things. And to be more specific, I mean, there's the classic example of the Eurogroup as an informal body that doesn't have actual decision-making authority, but does seem to take a lot of the decisions on fiscal policies and so on in an informal setting. Whereas, of course, the formal accountability mechanisms for this, that's to say the democratic control, is still at the national level. So the national parliaments are in charge of fiscal policy, but then there's all these informal pressures at the European level. Or another example, the fact that at the Eurogroup level there's so little agreement on reforms and on fiscal policy has meant that also the ECB is overstretched and has to pick up a lot of the things that are not being done by the member states, thereby overstretching its mandate and its accountability regime. So to be more specific, one question that I would have for Mr. Buti, but as well for the representatives from France and Germany would be, there was one extremely good suggestion from my point of view in the reflection paper on deepening EMU. On page 28, it suggests a legal agreement to have the Eurogroup be accountable to the European Parliament, and that could be done, of course, also in the context of a Eurogroup president who might also be part of the European Commission. So I was wondering if there's now in the short term and also in the longer term debate on the future of EMU, if there's a lot of focus going into these questions of accountability, legitimacy, and how to have concrete legal mechanisms that enable that. Thank you.
Thank you. Was there another question related to this? Yeah, Bernard.
Yes.
If it's related?
Well, maybe. I mean, it's not very related. Of course, in the end, everything has to do with everything. Well, I asked. Go ahead. So, two small points. The first one is for the two representatives from France and Germany. Sorry, I'm Blanca Sánchez Robles from Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia in Spain. So, first point. Don't you think that in the years after the crisis we have all become much more Keynesians and we have forgotten about structural reforms, and that's precisely what we should tackle now, like removing red tape, improving efficiency in markets, making welfare state function with more efficiency, reduce the size of public sector. What do you think about that? And then the other point is more perhaps oriented towards the academics. How do you think we could reach an agreement in a common tax policy if we differ so much in preferences? For example, about the welfare state. If a person from a Finnish person, a person from Finland, thinks about this topic in a very different way from a person from Germany, I think. So in that context, how are we going to reach an agreement about if we want to, in the end, have lower taxes or higher taxes? Thank you.
Okay, perhaps I start on my left. Thomas, the first question was very precise on the Eurogroup.
Yeah. I think we need to talk about a ship. They call it ownership. It's called ownership. One of the problems which made this debate come up that you have rightly described is that a country got into trouble. That was for a good part because of bad policies in the past. So maybe even of the current government, and then it had to ask for help, and it got the help, but together with what we call conditionality, it should be the advice and looking at it from a creditor point of view, it was shielding the country from the markets for a 3-year period, and advising and giving help and giving money for that country to reform under that shield during the 3 years. So you might call that a sheer solidarity act. Of course, it was perceived differently, and you described it correctly, but that is also because there haven't been many governments profiting from this help, which said, great that we get the solidarity from our colleagues, because otherwise we will be dead swimming in the pool, belly up. And of course we're going to do this and design this together with our friends from the other countries and the support from the Commission and all of that. This has very rarely happened. So there were lots of politicians saying back home that somebody came about them and enforced some policies which they never wanted to do. That's of course the opposite from the ship I was talking about, the ownership. And I think that is part of the problem. Now you can turn it around and say this leads to a democracy problem or democratic legitimacy problem. I think that's a bit difficult. The other side of the coin is the member states in the Eurozone, which have put together in over a week's time billions of money in credits and then in the end in real capital in the ESM institution, they have to justify themselves in their national parliament. None of these guys can go home and say, look, we're going to pay in 10 billion next month into a newly created fund in Europe, and I was talking to this to the European Parliament after having been to the Eurogroup, and they doubled the sum, but this is the democratic legitimacy they have, and now we need to pay it. This wouldn't work because we have a national democratic system in which all of these ministers have to justify themselves. And I can tell you, when I spend a good part of my job time in the Bundestag, in our parliament, exactly pre-justifying what we will do in the Eurogroup, justifying after the meeting what we have done in the Eurogroup. So I feel that there's plenty of democratic legitimacy. I see that in the future state of Europe, if there was a discussion about real European money, which we had contributed to Europe over years, and now we need to decide on the spending. Here you have a legitimacy point to link that to the parliament, but I think that is already basically done. Structural reforms bridge the difficulties, or you want me to stop?
Very briefly. I thought structural reforms were your first priority anyway. I wanted to have you address the same question of democratic accountability, because Thomas mentioned ownership, national ownership. Is it wrong to say that there's a very good correlation between national ownership and the success of the programs and their cost?
Okay, there are two different issues. I agree with that fully, but what was Thomas was mentioning, it was national ownership on the part of the creditors.
Also.
Now, okay, it is okay. To take your point, no, absolutely true that national ownership has been a key element in the success of the programs. I mean, okay, here we are talking about. When we think about ESM, EFSF programs, or even before the balance of payments and for the first shock with countries outside the euro area, what is fresh in the memory is Greece, let's face it. We always think about that. But I think we have to put things in perspective. And if you take the first wave of programs and you take then also the euro area member states, I mean, we have had, I would say here, a stunning success looking at what the situation is now. You look at the forecast today. You take not only Ireland, special situation. I mean, with a lot of structural, favorable structural features. But you take also when Spain was affected by the shock, not full program, but on financial. Portugal also now. As well, Cyprus and growth eventually coming back on Greece as well, and it is clear that the degree of ownership on the programs with difficult beginnings, because I mean, it was Latvia, which was I mentioned the euro area. I think in Latvia clearly the first in the first wave. I think the success now on the let's say exploiting the better economic climate, better growth. Inside the Europe and outside is also very much related to the reforms made during the hard times of the program. This is as far as the ownership of the countries which had to apply for EU IMF assistance. Now then there is the issue of ownership and the democratic let's say accountability, ownership of the creditors. Now, I think what we did during the crisis was to fix the plane while we were flying, also from the point of view of building institutions. So we started with pooling the funds for Greece, then the EFSF, EFSM, and then eventually the ESM. But it is true that thinking about the let's say the steady state. Input legitimacy is as important as output legitimacy. And from that viewpoint, I think the perception that you have bodies which are not fully legitimized, they have certainly the legitimacy at the national level. Each parliament clearly has that empowerment, certainly. But collectively, there is no, complete accountability, and also from the point of view of the debtor, so the receiving countries, the fact that you do not have full democratic legitimacy, I think, is an issue. So from looking forward, thinking about the steady state and the final equilibrium, I think having decision making and bodies which are more in line with classic community method, I think would be a big plus and an important development. I mean, what we are going to do in December when we come forward with the package on EMU, we are going to have a proposal. I know it's not going to fly very easily, but I think it's important to communitarize the ESM, so to move from no, to incline. Okay, no, the slope is important. So gradient. No, to communitarize the ESM and to make this EU body, obviously in a very prudent way. You'll see the proposal when it comes up. And I think for the Eurogroup also there has been a debate on the degree of transparency of this. I think the transparency of the Eurogroup has increased in the past, but there's still a way to go. So having a certain element of better accountability vis-à-vis European bodies, in particular the European Parliament, I think is important. Page 28, I think you have read the reflection paper very well. I think that's what we put forward there.
See, even page 28 was read. Massimo, a comment on corporate tax harmonization and different national preferences.
Yes, but I arrived there. I mean, I cannot resist about these things are democratic, but I'm getting there. I'm not wasting time. I mean, honestly, we have to look at the situation how it is now and how we are going. I think that all this, I don't think, I think that there is enough democratic legitimacy as it is in Europe, so it's not such a big issue if you look at the things. But there are, but if we really want to solve this problem, at the end, where we have to go? We have to go in a situation, I want to be very blunt here. We don't have to invent anything new. We have to come in a situation which is a separation between the federal government and the national government. The federal government, which means the European Parliament, the European, the Council of the Council of the European or Euro members, have something to say, and they have their tax base, they are making their decision, and they are accountable to citizens and whatever. So at the end, where we have to go, it has to be this kind of clear division of responsibility. Otherwise, we keep going all this kind of mixed accountability, which create problems. I think at a certain point, we will have to converge there, because I don't think so, otherwise we will never be able to solve completely this confusion. Concerning corporate taxation, okay, let me say just two things. First, at the moment, we don't even know what we call profits around the country in Europe is different in each country, because we don't define them in the same way. So at the very least, let's start to have the same definition. This is the idea of a consolidated corporate income tax base, which I've been discussing for years and still there. Second, once you have done that, it does not mean that you have to impose the same tax everybody, but everywhere. But then you can appropriate the tax base in a more sensible way, avoiding tax avoidance, tax shifting, whatever. That would be second thing. Third, I think that there is a problem. I mean, there is a problem, a moment in which we want to ask if we can really allow country inside whether you have perfect capital mobility, perfect corporate mobility, you can allow country to set up the tax as they like. I know that the treaty at the moment is like that, but I think this is a problem we should start rising again, because we do have a proper tax competition in Europe. And a long time ago, I mean, because we are always there, I mean, with the Rudy report, one of the proposals was exactly the introduction of a minimum corporate tax rate. So you could not go below the minimum corporate tax rate. And there are also some kind of theoretical argument to suggest that this is actually better than cooperation or having just the same tax rate. I'll stop it. The same tax rate.
Thanks a lot. Finally, Daniel.
I would the Romanian Central Bank, Daniel Dean. I'd like to ask you something. What's been striking from this panel debate too, and it's not a something which is not known, is that there is a clear discrepancy of views on what it takes for the euro area to become more robust, clearly. I mean, I've been listening to Mr. Westphal, it's the line of reasoning, then Monsieur Massé. Well, I'll ask you, and Mr. Westphal has said, look, we've been in a recovery period for 4 years now, so it's strange to say that we are entering a period of good times. Okay, Mario Buti has explained why we think, because we're just closing now the output gap. But I'm asking you, for years the ECB has been practicing unconventional policies. So this is a combination of cyclical recovery, which has been underpinned by unconventional policies. The moment you start to normalize policies, assuming that it can be done, and I have big doubts we can normalize policies, but assuming that we do normalize policy, what do you think is going to happen? I mean, we do have continuous structure divergence inside the euro area. So what's going to happen? Do we have the buffers in the euro area to stop capital fleeing the weaker, the more fragile member states? I think this is the big issue. Because if capital starts to flee, again, Italy, Portugal, Spain, I mean, we should ask ourselves what's going to happen. And a new episode of recession will happen. I mean, this is a market economy. It's inevitable to happen again. So do we have the buffers? And my question is, do we have, what is the critical mass of buffers the euro area needs so that we should fend off? I mean, it's a new hit. And I think here we have a clash of conceptual, of views, a clear clash of views.
You said I ask you.
No, I'm asking both. I mean, it's if we don't have the grand bargain in this respect, then we should worry about the future.
Yes, thank you for this question. I think, I don't know what we need exactly. It's very difficult to say what will fix the euro area and be sure that whatever the crisis, it will be sufficient. But what I'm sure is that we have to go in the right direction. And that's what I try to explain. We have to do more regarding responsibility, and we have to do more regarding risk sharing and solidarity in the Eurozone. But I cannot say what is necessary to have much lower level of debt, or at the same time, private risk sharing. I think it's very important to work on that and to see if we think that what is important is private risk sharing, public risk sharing, lower level of debt. Those are key questions in order to answer your question. But I'm not able to say exactly what are the right levels in order to be sure that whatever happens, we are ready. But I'm sure we have to go in the right direction in order to make Eurozone more resilient.
I'm not absolutely sure I really got your point, but I will try to answer what I understood. I agree we are living on the back a little bit of unconventional monetary policy. I thought we had constructed a Eurozone on the basis of monetary policy only caring about inflation. Now even people here on the podium have talked several times about this being the only show in maintaining demand, which is clearly was not the initial idea, but maybe okay. So we are living in unconventional support times from the monetary policy side, and we have not been able on the fiscal side to normalize the situation in the sense that since we are after 4 years here in a growth period, to have a surplus in the budget. There's one country, which is the one I'm coming from, which has a surplus and which is criticized for having a surplus in good times. Okay. I think if we go on living on support from, well, at least a little bit supportive fiscal policy and 150% supportive monetary policy, if we wait for the next downswing to come, we will be in big trouble. So we need to use this good time. This is what I've been saying. And I think if you ask a German this question, the answer will come back straight. This is have a solid, credible policy and a solid, credible economic development, and then you can convince markets to stay in once the times get rough. And of course, if you have your public finances in order, you can offer public spending if times get rough. If the monetary policy has normalized, by then they could offer a reduction of interest rates and the normal things you guys do in this situation. If you are continuously at 0% interest rates, your pocket is empty when it comes to the next crisis. And if the debt levels stay where they are today, the fiscal policy pocket is also empty. So this is why I worry about the next downswing. And I think we could have a perfectly economic discussion on whether there's still slack, whether how much the output gap is closed, or for how long it has been closed, or whatever. I just wonder how long the growth process can be maintained. I mean, just imagine in 2 years' time the growth is going down, and we say, no, you can't go down because we only closed the output gaps 2 years ago. Growth wouldn't reply positively, That's how long can this last? And I'm not so sure, but we only have so much time, and I can't tell you how much time we have, but I think we need to use the good time to prepare.
Let me just say, in defense of the question, I understood as the following. The fact that we now have relatively good times, it's only because we have the ECB doing all this heavy lifting. And if the ECB were to stop, we would fall into a situation where we would get recession and capital would flow widely from one country to the next. Let me say, I fundamentally disagree with that diagnosis because, let's take the case of Germany. If you have a current account surplus of 8% of GDP, although it has mysteriously dropped to 7 in your latest forecast, that means about every third euro saved must be invested abroad. And where can it go but elsewhere in the Eurozone? So in that sense, I'm pretty relaxed about the ECB stopping its conventional monetary policies. But I thought the premise was, if the ECB stops, all hell will break loose, and what do we do then? But you had another comment.
Yes, just to complete what Thomas says about, in my view, what is key is about regarding the ECB is the level of inflation, and the level of inflation. It's not working with me, obviously. Yeah, it must be B, I don't know why. And regarding inflation, we have to relate this question with the Phillips curve and what is happening in Europe regarding wages in the different countries. And I think this is an important issue to look at, because if we want to rebalance the Eurozone, regarding competitiveness, we have to look at wages in different countries. And at the end of the day, what is inflation? It's broadly the aggregation of the wages growth in the different countries. So I agree with the fact that if we had higher inflation, it will help everybody. And I'm not talking about 3% inflation. I'm just talking about going to 2%.
Very quickly on this. Our assessment based on this is that it is still too early to withdraw policy support on both sides, monetary and fiscal. I would like to put things a bit in perspective with just a couple of figures, because we tend here also to, not here in particular, but in general, to indulge in bashing our system of surveillance. The Stability Pact doesn't work. It is true that the trust in the system has gone down, but one has to look a bit the results. Euro area deficit, 1%, just above 1%, 2017. US, 5%. Japan, over 4%. Growth in the past 5 years, average 2.5 US, 1.5 the Eurozone. So, in conditions which have been, pretty tough indeed, I think having brought down the deficit to this, and it is so expected to continue to come down in the next 2 years. Does not seem to be a performance that is showing irresponsible policies. True, sometimes the SGP has been implemented in ways which are, let's say, different than the original script. But in terms of delivery, I think one cannot let's say, rubbish what has been done. And you can say, okay, it is the euro area average. But even if you look at performance across member states, you look at the exit from EDP from 24 countries, and we are left to 2. And they are going to go out if everything goes well. I mean, next year. I think certainly QE has helped, and more monetary policy.
Can I just make the question more precise? You said policy stimulus should not be withdrawn totally now. Your forecast of relatively good growth rates in the future, are they based on continuing policy stimulus or on a reduction in the policy stimulus?
No. Okay, we have a forecast which is based on so-called unchanged policies. It is that our
QE forever. QE forever.
No. It is. We have taken the reduction in QE, and then we let's say project in the future, not going into excessive details on that front there. So let me be slightly ambiguous on this, profiting from the ambiguity on this. It is very clear on what we do on the fiscal side, which is no policy change, which means basically the structural balance remains broadly unchanged.
Thanks. There were 2 people over there who have been extremely patient. One, and I think somewhere in the vicinity, if you could both ask your question. On the right-hand side there.
Yeah, my name is Mattis. I'm from the Gros Institute for Economic Research, and I would like to come back to one of the issues that has been raised during the discussion pretty early on the question of whether some measures of risk reduction could maybe increase the risks. So we were talking about the maturity extension as soon as a country would enter into an ESM program. On the face of it, this might raise risk potentials, but on the other hand, we have built the ESM in order to just avoid what has been into the window as a scare scenario that highly indebted countries in the end face increased risk premiums and enter into a spiral that ends with default, basically. So what we need is a credible ESM, and everybody knows the capacity of the ESM does not suffice for larger EMU countries. And so the maturity extension would be a measure to make the ESM credible. And this is a big issue in order to, well, reduce risk in the system. And when you look at the face of it, a maturity extension on the condition of interest rates or interest being continuously paid is a very minor reduction in the present value of the debts. So obviously the financial markets could tatter a bit, but in the end, it's overall a reduction in the risk system.
Okay, there was somebody in your vicinity who had a question, yes.
Hi,
really very brief now, we are already at...
very brief. To Thomas Westphal, you said one of the major future challenges is consolidating public debt levels. And you said we have mechanisms in place, and you put it very diplomatically. You said also perhaps they are not implemented to full efficiency. My question is, the old execution is saying, rules are only as good as rule following, and rule following is only as good as rule enforcement. So given these mechanisms in place, according to your own wording, what efficiency do you think has the rule enforcement mechanisms?
Okay, and finally I had 2 people also have been very patient here. One you and... Okay, super quick, yeah. And now people have to go. So very quick, you have to have a last round.
Joost van Eersel of the European Economic and Social Committee. Question to Mr. Massé and Mr. Westphal. Mr. Westphal makes a clear distinction between things that have necessarily to be done at European level, and he says for the rest, it is a responsibility of the member states, we cannot intervene in their labor market mechanisms, for instance, when they don't work. Clean your own garden. Mr. Massé says, on the other hand, we have a long list of things that have to be Europeanized, including elements that Mr. Westphal considers to be purely national, I suppose. Is there, how do you see the discrepancy between Mr. Westphal's view on what has to be organized at national level in order to bring the trade further on track, and your own view that a number of policies have to be introduced, notwithstanding what, despite what has certainly to be done at national level, in order to get the train driven in the right, conducted in the right way.
Thanks a lot. That fits perfectly with my plan to end the session. I start on my left and then end up with Massimo. Very briefly, since everybody I think he has to run.
Yes, okay, sure. Rule enforcement. I think I mentioned that I see a vanishing or a vanished consensus on the fiscal rules. So we have a fiscal set of rules, which I would call one of the pillars of our EMU. It's a rules-based system, but today you would find maybe 19 different point of views, or 20 if you put the Commission in that. On what that means and how it should be applied. So I think we have to absolutely re-establish the solidity of this column, because otherwise this is not very solid. But I agree, of course, with you, and I think that's inclined in what I said. You cannot insist on rules which everybody reads in a different way and nobody applies anyway, or I'm exaggerating. So we have to work on that, and I think this needs to be on the agenda, and it will be. I mean, the Eurozone ministers have discussed that, and if you listen to what Dijsselbloem said after the Eurogroup on Monday, he said this is one of the fiscal issues which is on the table. We need to re-establish a consensus on these rules, and it could be different rules, or the rule set is quite expensive today, so extensive, not expensive, extensive. So we need to work on this to come to a set of rules where we have a consensus, and then it can be applied, it should be applied, and we need to think about how to apply it. I would have a tendency to favor a technical analysis of the application of the rules, which is public, and then a political decision taken on what to draw as a political conclusion from that. So we perfectly keep the political approach from the Commission, but we need, in addition to that, a technical approach which gives you the fact in the first place. We have that in Germany. Our Kartellamt, which is the competition authority, can say a merger is against the rules, can't be done, and it's fully transparent, it's published, and then the economic minister, by law, has a possibility to overrule that. But he has to do that in public, and it's perfectly legitimate, transparent, political, whatever. So I think this is the way forward here. I think, the two of us, we work together on a weekly basis, monthly basis. We meet in Berlin, in Paris, and we discuss all these issues in very much detail. And I wouldn't overestimate the distances. I wouldn't. I think that Emmanuel would agree that there's lots of things to do. And if you look at what France does with under the new government, it's precisely this. They're tackling reform issues in France. And this is giving, I'm following Macron's argument here fully, this is giving credibility for European arguments. If you don't do anything at home and you only claim European solutions, not really credible, I would suppose. So I think that there is a good bridge, and we're walking towards each other. I have to make a disclaimer on I can't offer any political way today, because back home we don't have a government. I mean, we always have a government, but it's a caretaker government. I don't know, but I think everybody can count on a future way of compromise on a number of things in this area between France and Germany, taking things forward.
Yes. fully share what Thomas says about your question. So if we have to work on it and work together, and we are doing it on a regular basis. Regarding the question of automatic maturity extension, because I think it's a key question, for me, it's not a measure of risk reduction, clearly not. When we are talking about, banks, and it's a matter of risk reduction, but here it's not a matter of risk reduction. It's a shift of risk from the ESM to the market, and we are very worried about the reaction of the market regarding such automatic, restructuration or automatic maturity extension or anything related to an automatic way to have an automatic, mechanism which decrease the value of the obligation on the market. So that's why we are very, very reluctant about such measures.
Thanks a lot. Marco.
Okay, no, very briefly, I think on the question, I expressed myself before. No, I think that is not a good idea. We have CACs, we have provision in the ESM treaty that allows to consider private sector involvement when needed. I think we should not invent anything else, not going beyond the IMF doctrine. We don't want to trigger credit events which would either bring forward the market instability in the first place whenever there is a let's say expectations of possible application to have help, or maybe even worse, delay the countries coming forward for help because they fear the credit event and debt reprofiling, which is basically debt restructuring also. So I don't think that's the way to go. There are other ways we can discuss in another occasion to increase market discipline, not that one. I think the final point I would like to make maybe is going back to what Daniel asked in the first place on self-insurance versus some euro area instruments. I think self-insurance is important, but put your house in order, which is what is behind the self-insurance, is necessary but not sufficient. So I think creating the room for maneuver to respond, yes, but what we have seen in the experience of the past few years is glaring, and I think it was mentioned by Massimo at the beginning, you cannot force creditor to do things against the will. So, and I think that increases the political controversies and tensions within the Eurozone. So I think having something which has strong rebuilding the buffers and having self-insurance coupled with, for large shocks, with the possibility to intervene at the euro area level with a fiscal capacity providing stabilization, I think is something which would help a lot reduce the tensions and the political controversy within the Eurozone, and also help to implement the rules, putting more emphasis on sustainability rather than stabilization.
Massimo.
Okay, on the question about the automatic restructuring of public debt, which is the proposal about the ESM to increase or enlarge market discipline. I'm not very much a believer in market discipline because, what we have seen a lot of time is that market tend to be smooth for a long time and then react to suddenly. So, we know there are a lot of problems in financial market will lead to self-fulfilling equilibrium, multiple equilibria, so you might create a lot of instability. You might also end up by making a country which maybe has a liquidity crisis be insolvent. So we have to be very careful with what you do when you send signal to the financial market. What I'm very much afraid is another kind of Deauville effect. You walk on a beach, then you go there, you say, at the end of the walk on the beach, you say, from tomorrow we are, by the way, from tomorrow we are going to have private sector involvement all the time that we save a bank and you have the euro crisis. So you have to be very careful. What I believe instead is on external forces. So I think we have to increase more we have to make this rule more more able to deliver what has done in the past. Even if I more or less broadly share what he was saying, Marco Buti, before about the result of this fiscal surveillance, let me remind you that when we talk about the relation, when we talk about reducing debt level, we are talking about reducing debt over GDP. And clearly when the GDP goes down, nominal GDP, as happened in a number of cases, is very difficult to reach this result. And I mean, I would like just a word of caution. I mean, the output gap as we measure, you know, it has the common methodology is something which there are a lot of hysteresis going there. So I mean, the risk is that if the country goes down, then you assume that the output gap is reducing, while it's not, because there are all these hysteresis. So we have to be careful. I think now situation is improving, so I think that is the moment in which we have to make more step in enforcing the rule. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Massimo. With only a few minutes delay, we can now start into the coffee break. We'll soon have the keynote speech by the governor of the Banque de France, so please be back on time. And Clemens, would you like to add anything? No. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.